We welcome you to the WMAR Vault. I'm Jamie Costello. Here at WMAR, we're celebrating 75 years on the air. We were the first TV station on the air here in Maryland. And now we're setting our sights on the future and streaming. We're mixing up the old and the new, opening up the WMAR Vault and dusting off 16 million feet of archive footage. And this time, we're going to the Baltimore City Fair, a celebration of our neighborhoods and culture, a counterpart to the county fairs. It ran every September from 1970 up until 1991. And we went to the Charles Center, we went to the Inner Harbor area, we were underneath the JFX, and finally to Memorial Stadium. In 1974, WMAR put a show together looking back on the big stories we covered since going on the air in 1947. It was hosted by George Rogers, and it ran right outside of a booth at the City Fair that year. Here now is anchor George Rogers.
Throughout the week, every day, Channel 2 is on the air with Newswatch. 32 scheduled newscasts a week, covering stories that are breaking in the city and the state, reflecting the concerns of the people and the challenges facing their government. The big stories, the little stories, the news. This is not a regular newscast, however. This is a special 27-year report on Channel 2's news coverage that began on October 27, 1947. WMAR-TV was the first television station in Maryland, the 12th in the nation to go on the air. And on that first day, and every day since, we've covered the news. Emerging from a selection of stories spanning 4 decades is the birth of a new Baltimore, conceived in the 40s and subject to the dreams and disappointments, the achievements and frustrations that are as much a part of a city's growth as they are of human development. When all individual differences are added up, a city and its people are one and the same. So let's look at some of the local stories that made television news over the last 27 years. And we'll start with the 40s. And let's start with a man who was reporting the news to you at that time, Dave Stickle, now Public Affairs Director of WMAR-TV.
Just a little more than 3 years after the end of World War II, the film cameras of WMAR-TV began recording the news. At that time, the hub of retail shopping was still Howard and Lexington streets. Branches and suburban shopping centers were still in the future. And wrestling was a strong attraction at the old Coliseum, and two-ton Tony Galento was one of the big drawing cards. Remote telecasts of the wrestling matches were a weekly feature on WMAR-TV, with most of the TV sets in those early days being located in appliance showrooms and corner taverns. By the late 40s, the days of the streetcar were numbered. A WMAR-TV news cameraman took a nostalgic ride on the Guilford Avenue Viaduct just before it was leveled to make way for new bus routes. And in that first year of television in Baltimore, the city celebrated its 150th anniversary. The 5th Regiment Armory was the center of the public observance, with the monumental city paying tribute to its historic past. On October the 27th, 1948, Governor Lane and Mayor D'Alessandro joined the late E.K. Jett, then general manager of WMAR-TV, to mark Channel 2's first anniversary.
Maryland's pioneer television station was born 1 year ago today. At 6:34 p.m. in the evening, after hectic days and sleepless nights of preparation, WMAR-TV's test pattern was placed on the air. Programs began 3 days later.
TV was brand new, but during the war, Baltimore, the city, had become shabby as its urban core deteriorated. The city's rejuvenation began in the late 40s. The old gas lamps came down and new street lighting began. Then, meanwhile, renovation began on the old 33rd Street Stadium. Eventually, a new Memorial Stadium, which was to become the home for Major League Sports, was built on the same site. And as the city began to wake up from the war, the streets, neglected and filled with potholes, were resurfaced, and Baltimore began its dramatic physical revival. And in August of 1949, WMAR-TV began experimenting with color programming when the station demonstrated the CBS spinning disc color system, a crude beginning in color TV, but the foreshadowing of things to come. Today, virtually every program on Baltimore television is in color.
The 50s. What were the stories making news in Baltimore? The return of the big league Colts and the Orioles, the construction of Friendship Airport, the Harbor Tunnel, and the Baltimore Beltway. A new announcer back from the Korean War joined the WMAR TV staff. A young man destined to become one of the best-liked personalities on Baltimore television. So for the climate of the 50s, let's turn to Stu Kerr.
At the outset of the 50s, the Hippodrome Theater on Utah Street was still featuring vaudeville, including a variety of now forgotten Hoofers, the Three Stooges, and other headliners. But the impact of television entertainment was being felt, and vaudeville finally came to an end here in 1952. The huge 33rd Street Bowl, which housed the teams of the Orioles in the old International League, also had its day. Through bond issues and much legal wrangling, a new stadium began to take shape as the city continued rebuilding through the 50s. Memorial Stadium was completed just in time to accept the Orioles' new franchise in the American League. Opening day was April 15th of 1954. A record-setting crowd lined the parade route along Charles Street to welcome its new Major League team. Mrs. Babe Ruth was in the reviewing stand at City Hall. And when the Orioles met the White Sox in the opener at the stadium, the first ball was thrown out by then Vice President of the United States, Richard Milhouse Nixon. Other parts of the city began to assume new physical shape through the 50s under the direction of Mayor Thomas D'Alessandro Jr. He initiated so many schools, off-street parking garages, hospitals, municipal swimming pools, and playgrounds that he became known as the building mayor. In one day, he broke ground for 4 municipal projects, including an elementary school, an off-street parking garage, and 2 swimming pools. 1921, the Polly Follies began a tradition that continued during the 50s. But Polly was breaking tradition during that decade also. 2 years before the Supreme Court's historic desegregation decision of 1954, black students were admitted to Polly. Following the Supreme Court decision of 1954, Baltimore became the first school district in the United States to embrace an open enrollment policy. As a result, black students attended Southern High when the school opened in September of that year. It didn't happen easily, but it was another step for equal opportunity. At the start of the decade, Friendship Airport was dedicated. The cost then a modest $15 million, and President Truman flew over from Washington to be the guest of honor. Mayor D'Alessandro flew with him, his first airplane flight. Construction on the Baltimore Beltway began in January of 1954. Its completion gave the city a unique 39-mile paved horseshoe highway serving 7 Baltimore County communities with a population of more than 200,000. It was completed in June of 1962 and formally opened on July 1st. Its total cost was more than $68 million, or about $2 million a mile. Another major development in the field of transportation was the Harbor Tunnel, which was dedicated and opened on November 29, 1957. It was built at a cost of $144 million and featured twin lanes of traffic in each of the 2 tubes, buried 100 feet deep in the Baltimore Harbor.
Now for a look at the 1960s, here is WMAR TV reporter Susan White.
The 60s saw the building of Baltimore Civic Center, which opened in October 1962. The total cost of $14 million included raising a 5-acre downtown area and construction of the center on Baltimore Street between Hopkins Place and Howard Street. Mayor Grady, with Commission Chairman Charles P. McCormick, placed a time capsule in the cornerstone of the building. Later, on January 6, 1961, Mayor Grady spoke of plans for the future.
In its earliest beginnings, Charles Center was just a dream, a plan. Today, it became a reality.
Then the wreckers came in with cranes, steel balls, bulldozers, and great chunks of old buildings in the heart of downtown Baltimore crumbled. This to make way for the elaborate and bold rebuilding, to clear 22 acres and replace them with modern buildings at a cost of more than $127 million. Today we know the Charles Center is an area with tall modern buildings and spacious lobbies to attract citizens to colorful exhibits. On November 20th, 1964, the Reverend Harry Lee Dahl was installed as Bishop of the Protestant Episcopal Church of Maryland. The service was attended by clergy representing all faiths of the city's religious community. A characteristic of the 60s was a growing ecumenical movement in which clergy and congregations began to seek ways to understand and respect religious differences. The 60s was also a period of increasing national upheaval, and in Baltimore in 1964, McKeldin signed into law equal rights legislation which opened all facilities to minorities. But while the chant, "We shall overcome," resounded, and equal housing was the law of the land, segregation of Baltimore's neighborhoods persisted. Then, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Baltimore and many American cities erupted in devastating riots. In Baltimore, the riot began the evening before Palm Sunday, 1968, on Gay Street, and was declared out of control within 5 hours. The National Guard was activated and more than 4,000 federal troops brought in. Before the curfew was lifted on April 11th, there were more than 5,000 arrests. Later, the city began the awesome task of repairing its wreckage and healing its racial wounds. Across the nation, the 1960s war in Vietnam was protested, and these protests were reflected in Baltimore. Demonstrators marched on the Johns Hopkins campus, calling for an end to what has been described as the most unpopular war in our nation's history. The 60s, too, brought environmentalists into action across the nation. In Baltimore, ecologists pointed to smokestacks belching pollution from the sky, the open burning of trash and sewers which poured their effluents into the streams. Resolving to do something about the conditions, the environmentalists fought and won many battles for legislative reforms in all areas of pollution, increased citizen awareness of the environment, and advantages of recycling led to the city's beginning to clean up.
We'll return for a final look at the 1970s after this brief pause.
There was ecstasy for the Orioles, who won pennants both in 1970 and 71 after taking divisional titles in the American League East. But while there was jubilation in the Oriole clubhouse, it could not compare to the delirium which struck Baltimore after it won its first World Series in October 1966 by taking 4 straight from the Los Angeles Dodgers. Hurricane Agnes struck the Baltimore area and central Maryland on June 21st, 1972, leaving 21 dead and more than $55 million property damage in its wake. On June 22nd, Mayor Schaefer ordered the evacuation of the entire Jones Falls Valley area after officials thought that the dam at the southern end of the Lake Roland was near breaking. Then, in October of 1973, Maryland's favorite son, Vice President Agnew, resigned after pleading no contest to income tax evasion. Mr. Agnew, a former Baltimore County executive, had been succeeded by Dale Anderson. In March of 1974, Anderson was found guilty of taking kickbacks from contractors who had been awarded county construction contracts. Immediately following the jury verdict, Mr. Anderson asserted his innocence and said he would appeal the decision. 1974 saw the completion of the Waxter Center for Senior Citizens, which was funded from a city bond issue for $3.8 million, a place of hope for the elderly. It was named for the late Thomas J.S. Waxter, the former head of both the city and state welfare departments. During the 1970s, the pride of Baltimore's inner harbor, the refurbished frigate Constellation, was moved to a permanent berth named in its honor. Brought to Baltimore a decade earlier, the 1797 ship is already a tourist attraction and certain to be a highlight of the bicentennial celebration. During the 1970s, the 240-acre Inner Harbor project got off the drawing boards and became a reality. Capital investment from public and private sources amounted to approximately $450 million. Problems were in abundance as 1974 began. Some were solved and some were not. In February, Baltimore motorists experienced serious gasoline shortages as filling station tanks went dry and gasoline prices skyrocketed. To conserve the precious fuels, alternate days for obtaining gasoline were imposed on motorists, as well as a statewide speed limit of 55 miles per hour. By summer, supplies were almost back to normal, but prices remained high. Higher prices and discontent over wages also led in 1974 to 2 municipal strikes. First by the sanitation workers, then by some police. The sanitation strike began July 1st. As the refuse and garbage piled up, citizens took their own trash to designated dumps and landfills for open burning until the new contract for the workers was signed. The police strike was not a citywide general strike. A majority of the officers stayed on the job while other union members walked the picket line. For the average consumer, there was no chance to strike against high prices. Inflation strapped the Baltimore consumer more and more as the year progressed. Prices began to spiral with the removal of the federal wage and price freeze, and the Baltimore housewife began to count her pennies in the city's markets as the family budget was seriously threatened. Despite these problems, the renaissance of downtown Baltimore, which began in the 50s, continued into the 70s. People began to return at night to the city's theaters, restaurants, concerts, and festivals. One stage downtown began providing public entertainment, and Hopkins Plaza became the downtown focal point for music and drama, art and fashion shows, civic rallies, and children's programs. As more and more citizens became involved in the attractions of downtown Baltimore, they became convinced that Mayor Schaefer was right in assuring them that downtown after dark was safe. The Baltimore City Fair, which began in 1970, soon became the symbol of the revitalization of our city. With more than 10,000 volunteers working together to make it succeed, it has become the model for other cities in America. 1974's fair, a three-day celebration, brought together representatives of 62 neighborhoods and 17 ethnic groups. And this is what the City Fair was meant to do. In 1974, the fair attracted almost 2 million visitors. They shared in the spirit of the new Baltimore, a city proud of its diversity, and those who worked and those who came are the new pioneers on the Baltimore urban scene, people who live in a vital city and who believe we are all in it together.
As I said in the beginning, emerging from a selection of stories carried on Channel 2 News over the last 27 years is the birth of a new Baltimore and its determination to be a city of the future. As that future unfolds, WMAR TV will continue to be there with our cameras, covering the stories of the city and its people, which, after all, are one and the same.
Each week, we'll open up the WMAR vault to bring you a classic game on the WMAR YouTube channel. This time, it's the 2001 Turkey Bowl between the Calvert Hall Cardinals and the Loyola Dons. It marked the 82nd time the two schools renewed their great rivalry. Let's check out the highlights. We start things off in the first quarter, no score. It's a big-time run by Marcus Thompson, the Calvert Hall back, with a 47-yard gain before he is finally brought down. Later, it's Thompson again, churning those legs. On 3rd and 4, he gets 10. Great job by the offensive line to open up that hole. Thompson scoots through and picks up some more. The Cardinals are able to open the scoring. Ben Pardue converts on the 24-yard field goal, gives the Hall a 3-0 lead. Time for Loyola to try and respond. Quarterback Marcus Frisbee flying upfield. On 3rd and 6, he takes off for a 13-yard scamper. After pump faking the throw, he decides the keeper is the best option, keeps the drive alive. Frisbee, he knows how to pick up yards, making guys miss. He takes it 12 more on the ground. And speaking of the ground, it's time for another Don to get involved. On 3rd and 22, Sebastian Price goes right up the gut, gets his field goal kicker a little closer, and it's close enough for Dennis Eaton. He knocks it through for a 29-yard field goal. We are all tied at 3 apiece. Later in the second quarter, Calvert Hall quarterback Andrew Goldbeck says, "Hey, Frisbee, I'll see your runs and raise you this." Goldbeck with a 70-yard scramble. Once he tucked it away, he had wide open spaces to try and score. He's tackled just before the goal line, all the way down to the 2. Matt Eckerl takes it the rest of the way. Next snap, touchdown. Puts his head down and gets across the goal line for the only TD of the day. The Cardinals jump in front 10-3. That's the way it would stay. Final chance for Loyola with a minute and a half to go in regulation. 4th and 11. The pass falls incomplete. Calvert Hall wins the Turkey Bowl by the final of 10-3. legendary Dons head coach Joe Brune's final game after leading Loyola for 35 years. Brune ends with a Turkey Bowl record of 19-16, the most games coached in the rivalry, the most games won in the rivalry. The full broadcast of the 82nd Turkey Bowl between the Cardinals and Dons is on the WMAR YouTube page. If you want to watch it again, maybe you had a son in the game or you played in the game, we're going to make it really easy to get there. Pull out your phone and scan the QR code on the screen right now. That will take you to the WMAR Classic Games from the Vault playlist on YouTube.
For 75 years, WMAR has brought the news into your home, from film to video to tiny digital cards. Over the air, cable, satellite, and now we're streaming. And we'll keep moving forward and remember to look back at the stories and the moments that made us all here in Maryland. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the WMAR Vault. Hope to see you next time. Hey, it's Jamie Costello. If you just enjoyed this episode of The Vault, you can check out more episodes by clicking on this box down here. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit that circle, and that'll subscribe you to WMAR 2 News for great content every single day.